guys, this is Jessica, and today I'm going to be creating this journal cover of the Tim Holtz Ideology 4x6 canvas journal. So I decided when I got this brand new journal that the first thing I was going to do was create the cover. And the colors I chose are Fiery Sunset and Desert Sand from the Dilutions paint line. And you could do this with any color, but these are the two colors that came in the Mixed Media Inspired June box, so that's what I decided to go with. So I just placed them down on my glass mat and sprayed them with water, and then began to place my journal down into them and smush it around, so I got a very loose, vintagey, watercolor inspired look. So I just keep going back, adding more and more paint in areas where I missed. I'm going to just keep doing this until I'm happy with the color placement. And I'm also going to do the same thing to colorize the ribbon that comes with the journal, and this is just solely to tie the book together. So I'm once again going in with the Dilutions Fiery Sunset paint, and I'm just spraying it with some water and mixing it with my finger, and then I'm placing that ribbon down into the paint. And I'm pushing it with my fingers so that some areas have a lot of paint, some just have a little, some have none, which is also going to help with that vintagey, shabby chic look that I'm trying to create. So after I've given my journal a chance to dry, I'm going to begin doing some stenciling. So I'm going to use my mini blending tool with Desert Sand, and the stencil I'm using is the TCW 6x6 Shape Landscape. Now I'm just going through and just only doing this in some areas, and then I'm going to rotate the stencil and do the same exact patterns, but now in a horizontal frame instead of vertical, just to have a little bit more interest, a little bit more variety in my stenciling. And then I'm going to use the Dilutions paint in Lemon Drop, and this is a really bright, almost neon color yellow, and I'm just mixing that with a little bit of water on my palette knife, and then I'm scooping it up with my palette knife and smacking it with my hand so that it causes drips. And I'm using the drips, moving the drips in sort of a diagonal pattern, so from the upper left corner down through the lower right corner. So here's some book paper that I cut into circles, and I like to go to my local library when they have their yearly sale of all different kinds of books, and the ones that are too dilapidated that they're going to burn because they can't be used anymore, the spines are falling apart, I like to buy those, and I bring them home and use them in my artwork. So these are a bunch of circles I had cut out previously, and here I thought the circle was a little too big, so I'm just trimming it down with my scissors. And then I'm going to just glue down a bunch of circles in different sizes. And again, this is just, I cut these sometimes when I'm watching TV. I just sit and I cut out stamps, or in this case, I cut circles freehand out of book paper. You could also trace circles on there and cut them out if you don't feel comfortable freehanding circles. So like I said, just in different sizes, I'm putting all these book text circles, and I'm also rotating the circles so that the book text is in different patterns. So sometimes it's upside down, sometimes it's sideways. Again, just making it a little bit more interesting and creating patterns within the book paper text. So while I am working with the book completely open so you can see the back and the front at the same time, these will end up being two separate things because when the book closes, obviously you're not going to see the front and the back at the same time. But I am working on it with the book open, as I just find that's a little bit easier to just do both at the same time. And I wanted them to match. So I am sort of working on them right now as an overall piece, and then I will end up separating them and doing two different patterns. So now I'm going back in with the Fiery Sunset Dilutions paint, and I'm just putting them right on the circles in only half of the circle, and then I'm spraying it with water so that there'll be some areas that are real dark, almost covering the book text, and then there'll be others where it's almost, translucent. It's more of just a watercolor. And I'm using my brush to spread out this paint a little bit so that it's not only on the circle. I'm wanting this to look very organic, like this has just been, this mess has been being collected for years and years and years, and not like I'm just purposely doing it. So after that's had a chance to dry, I realized I used a little too much water, and I washed away too much of the original paint and the full coverage, so I'm just adding some more back in with my finger, so that again I have some where it completely covers the book text and then others where it's more worn away. Next, I'm going to place down some pieces of Aero ephemera, and I picked colors out of the ephemera pack that went with my page, so reds and tans. I'm just going to be putting them up and down in a pattern, so this is going to be like another layer where I'm going to end up putting my final work. And I'm gluing all this down with Distress Collage Medium. And I'm putting a layer on the bottom of the ephemera, and then after I place it down on the journal, I'm also putting a layer on the top to seal it. And this is going to also ensure that it's not going to lift from my journal later on, because this is a really high quality adhesive, and because I'm doing a layer both on the top and the bottom, I'm sealing it to that fabric journal so that it'll also remain pliable, so I'll be able to open and bend and it won't get stiff or crunchy like some other adhesives. So I'm also going to put a piece of Aero ephemera on the back of the journal. I'm just going to do one on the back. And from here on out, I'm going to start treating them as two separate pages versus one large piece. Now I'm going to go back in and add some more splatters of the lemon drop paint, because I felt that too much of it had been covered up at this point, and I really liked that, so I wanted to add some. So you'll still see a few that are peeking out from behind the circles and the arrows, but now there's also some on top. So I'm embedding those pieces of ephemera with more paint splatters. Now this orange flower comes from the Vicky Boutin Kaleidoscope ephemera pack. And I am once again just placing that down with Distress Collage Medium. And then I also pulled a sticker from the Tim Holtz Ideology clipping sticker book that says little things. Now working on the back, I've also pulled two more flowers from that same ephemera pack by Vicky Boutin. And I'm just gluing those down on the back. Now I'm taking care as I'm putting all these pieces that I'm making sure to layer and overlap, meaning that the arrow went over the top of those book text flowers, and then now the flowers are overlapping the arrow, and this is creating more and more depth and anchoring all my pieces onto my book instead of letting them just float around in midair. So there's a little bit of rhyme or reason to how I'm placing these down. The main focus for me is that I'm making sure to overlap all of my pieces. So now after I did all those layers on my journal cover, I'm just setting that aside to dry for a minute, and I realized that the ribbon that comes with the book was a little bit too white now at this point after I had done all these vintage techniques to the cover. So I decided to get out my mini blending tool and the same color of distress paint I used on the cover, Desert Sand, and I'm just again sporadically adding this all along the ribbon so that I have some areas where there's a lot of this brown color and some where there's very little. It's just making it a little bit more distressed. And then I'm using my mini archival ink in black soot, and I'm rubbing that on the ribbon so there's also areas that have black on them to mimic the cover as well. And because this ink is permanent, it's a perfect thing to use for the ribbon because this will not lift in later projects. So I decided I liked that on the ribbon, so I also am taking the black archival and I'm rubbing it directly on my journal. And then because I don't want it to be really, really bold, I'm just using a baby wipe instantly and using that to smush out the ink a little bit before it dries permanent. And because I'm doing this right away when the ink is still wet, it's able to move with that baby wipe slightly so I can soften it so it's not just bold black lines of ink on my page. It does soften it out to look more like a black smudge or like soot. That's what I was trying to do, was make it look like it's dirty, but in a good way, not in like a gross, dirty way, but like in a it's aged and seen a lot of, history way, which makes it cool, in my opinion. Okay, so now I'm going back in with my TCW stencil and desert sand again on the mini blending tool, and I'm adding in some more stenciling. Now this time I'm being very careful to only do the dots because I only want polka dots. So I'm just going back in and carefully on just the small polka dot section of the stencil, I'm adding some of those in over all of the both covers. And now I'm using white gesso on a brush, and I'm going around the outside of the arrows and the flowers and pushing the background back a little bit because I kind of felt like it was too bright and I needed it to be softened a little bit. So I'm using gesso to do this because gesso won't cover quite as much as paint will. It's more of a semi-transparent medium when you're using it like this. So that's why I'm using gesso. It's the perfect product when you're trying to get a whitewashed look. Without having to do anything to it, gesso automatically gives you that look. And so I'm being careful not to get it on my flowers and my arrows, but if I did, which as you can see here, I got a little bit on that purple one, just wipe it off with my finger right away. And because I sealed it with Distress Collage Medium earlier, it wipes off perfectly as long as I do it while it's still wet. So I'm just continuing along, as you can see here, adding more and more gesso until I personally think it looks good. So this is very much so a personal, journey here when adding how much you should take away and how much you should leave. So I'm also having different amounts of gesso on my brush. So some areas are very bright white and they cover more. And then as there's less and less gesso on my brush, it becomes very light and almost like a dry brushing. It barely covers anything. So I'm doing this until I feel like I like the look of it and I'm happy. This is a very personal part of the project. So you would do as much or as little as you feel necessary, or maybe you don't think any of it's necessary. That's the beauty of art journaling. So as I said, I continued doing that until I was happy with it. And now I'm going back in with my stencil and adding some more dots on top of that gesso to just make it not quite as stark white. So the whitewashing is, again, getting pushed back into the background so that what you're really seeing are the flowers. So now I'm using a Stabilo All pencil in black, and I'm just drawing a little bit along the sides of my arrows and then activating it with a wet brush. And because this is a water reactive brush, the second that water hits it, it is going to move. So again, I'm just doing this to sort of highlight the edges of the arrows and add some depth to the background around my focal points. And I'm going to do the exact same steps on the back of the journal cover. Now, as you can see, I put a little bit of the pencil, I blend it out with my wet brush, then I have my working paint towel there, I blot up some of it, I take the pencil, I add some more in. So this is a very give and take, continuing to add layers, continuing to just keep doing this and working it until you like how it looks. It's not a one and done layering technique. This does take a lot of time, and sometimes you may take away too much and then you have to add some back in. Sometimes it's, you put too much to begin with, you take some out with the water, back and forth until you like how it looks. And there's really no way to shortcut this. You have to put the time in. Okay, now I've let this journal dry completely. It's been about 4 hours, and I'm going to go back in with my jelly roll pen in black, and I'm going to outline all of the flowers. So they have a very thin black border around all of the flowers. As you can see here, I'm just carefully outlining it. And you want to make sure you give your journal sufficient time to dry before you go in with your pens, because otherwise the adhesives and the resins inside the paint, the way the makeup of it is, can get into that nib of the pen and it will stop working. So make sure you give it plenty of time to dry before you do these steps. Now as I'm looking at this and I'm deciding the composition of it, I decided that the front wasn't balanced and I wanted another flower, so I'm going back several steps to add this flower. That would have made a lot more sense to add the flower earlier on, but I didn't think it needed anything until I was looking at it when it was finished. So again, I've given this lots of time to dry. This is actually the next day. I let this dry overnight. And now I'm adding the doodling around that yellow flower on the cover as well. And a final step to bring the whole thing together, I'm going to just add black paint splatters. So this is Dylusion's black marble paint that I added lots of water to, and then I'm just hitting my palette knife, and it's putting randomized droplets. So some are big, some are small, all different sizes. And I'm just doing this across the whole thing. And as soon as I'm done splattering and I think I have enough, this project will be done. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd love to see what kind of journal covers you are creating, so be sure to share with us using hashtag MixedMediaInspired. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of our future videos and tutorials. Thank you so much again for watching, and have a wonderful day.